Good evening and welcome back to the channel. This is our 9th episode. Part 9, Tonkin Gulf and the Disaster at Binh Gia. What you're about to hear is drawn directly from the official history of the United States Marine Corps in Vietnam, a 9-volume series researched and written by the Marine Corps History and Museums Division and published by the U.S. government. These aren't dramatizations or secondhand accounts. This is the Corps' own record of what happened, compiled from command diaries, after-action reports, oral histories, and the accounts of the men who were there. We'll be focusing on the years when Marine involvement was most intense, the advisory era of the early 1960s, the landing at Da Nang in 1965, the brutal fighting of 1966 and 1967, and the defining crucible of 1968. We'll follow Marines from the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta to the hills above Khe Sanh. Where possible, we will go into detail on specific actions and include additional references for you to dive deeper into this history. As always, if this content is to your liking, please ensure that you like and subscribe. The language is formal, the record is honest, and the story is remarkable. Let's begin. While the details of the expanded U.S. advisory program were being hammered out in Washington, the focus of the administration's concern swung abruptly from the battlefields of South Vietnam to the Tonkin Gulf off the coast of North Vietnam. In 2 separate incidents during the first week of August, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked U.S. Navy ships operating in international waters. A vigorous debate has since developed concerning the actual origins of the Tonkin Gulf incidents. It has been claimed that the Americans precipitated the attacks by supporting aggressive South Vietnamese naval patrols off the North Vietnamese coast. An international crisis ensued when the United States retaliated with limited airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval facilities. On August 6th, the U.S. Congress unanimously passed a joint resolution authorizing the President to use all measures, including the commitment of armed forces, to assist South Vietnam in the defense of its independence and territorial integrity. President Johnson signed the so-called Tonkin Gulf Resolution 5 days after it was passed, and in so doing, reaffirmed his pledge of full support for the government of Vietnam. U.S. Marines figured prominently in the crisis which followed the North Vietnamese attacks. A Marine Expeditionary Brigade, the 9th MEB, was activated from elements of the 3rd Marine Division and 1st Marine Aircraft Wing and deployed on-board amphibious shipping to a position off Da Nang, where it was available to support U.S. contingency plans. Its commander, Brigadier General Raymond G. Davis, and his staff attended planning conferences in Da Nang and reconnoitered possible landing sites near the city. But the MEB was not committed. Instead, the organization remained in existence throughout the remainder of 1964 and into early 1965, when, in March, 2 of its battalions were landed at Da Nang. The formation and subsequent commitment of the 9th MEB in the Republic of Vietnam are covered in detail in the 1965 history of U.S. Marine operations in the Republic of Vietnam. While the tensions generated by the Tonkin Gulf incidents never really subsided, the immediate crisis soon passed. Thereafter, the American attentions focused once again on South Vietnam, where the political and military situation began to deteriorate at an unprecedented rate after mid-year. Ironically, this process of accelerated decay coincided with the initiation of a new South Vietnamese pacification strategy designed to prevent just such an occurrence. One aspect of the strategy was the Chin Tang, Struggle for Victory plan. Announced by General Khan shortly after his rise to power, this campaign was similar in method and objective to the defunct Strategic Hamlet program. Like the earlier program, the Chin Tang Plan envisioned the restoration of government influence in selected rural areas through the coordination of military and paramilitary operations with social and economic development programs. While the Chin Tang campaign was better planned and far less ambitious than the Strategic Hamlet program, there were definite similarities between the two. The instrument for the social, economic, and political developmental phase of the new effort, for example, was the New Life Hamlet, a variation of the planned government community. Begun in some areas around mid-year, the New Life Hamlets were to become the symbol of the new pacification effort in much the same manner that the fortified hamlets had symbolized the earlier Strategic Hamlet program. Coincident with the Chin Tang campaign, a similar but locally concentrated pacification effort was instituted in the rural areas around Saigon. Designated the HOPTAC program, this campaign was conceived in order to link the 7 provinces around the capital into a zone of intensive pacification in which closely coordinated military, paramilitary, police, and civil activities would systematically reduce Viet Cong's strength. Because of their proximity to the area and their availability, the Vietnamese Marine Brigade and the Arvin Airborne Brigade were assigned primary responsibility for military operations in support of the HOPTAC campaign. By mid-year, the Chin Tang and HOPTAC plans emerged as the backbone of General Khan's strategy to stave off further communist advances in critical areas of the country. The development of the government's newest pacification strategy, however, was based on the assumption that the Viet Cong would pursue a campaign to strengthen their control in South Vietnam's populated rural areas. Such was not the case. Instead, at mid-year, the Communists began waging a brand of warfare characterized by large-scale mobile operations against government military forces. Obviously, the enemy had shifted to the general counteroffensive, that phase of guerrilla warfare designed to bring on the complete political and military collapse of the opposition. The new Viet Cong strategy revealed itself in 2 general geographic areas during the fall months. In Binh Dinh province on the coast of northern Tu Quoc, 2 Viet Cong main force regiments staged a series of particularly swift and successful attacks which virtually eliminated the government's presence except in the province capital, Quy Nhon, and a few district towns. In a coordinated offensive, the Communists increased pressure throughout that portion of the Central Highlands west of Binh Dinh province, thereby threatening to sever South Vietnam along an axis that extended roughly between Quy Nhon on the coast and Pleiku in the highlands. Meanwhile, another phase of the new initiative unfolded in Three Corps, where the government's HOPTAC campaign was just getting underway. There, the communist offensive threatened to neutralize the government's concentrated pacification campaign. Eroded by the political side effects of the battlefield developments, South Vietnam's fragile power structure became increasingly unstable. The last 5 months of 1964 brought frequent changes in the Saigon government, although General Khan was able to maintain a semblance of control until December. The turmoil then climaxed when Air Vice Marshal Nguyen Cao Ky, the commander of the Vietnamese Air Force, engineered a bloodless coup that forced Khan from the Saigon political scene. The frequent changes of government, coupled with the stepped-up Viet Cong military pressure throughout Vietnam, produced a downward spiral in the effectiveness of the Republic's armed forces. By the end of the year, it was becoming increasingly doubtful that the government could stave off total collapse, even with the increased volume of military assistance it was already receiving from the United States. Against this backdrop of communist military activities, unprecedented political instability on the part of the South Vietnamese, and mounting combat losses, American military involvement in Vietnam deepened. A restructured Military Assistance Command. In many respects, 1964 was a year of transition for the U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. Not only did the command experience a change in leadership when General Westmoreland replaced General Harkins as Commander U.S. MACV, but it was thoroughly reorganized in preparation for the more vigorous U.S. advisory program, which was expected to begin about mid-year. The major organizational change within MACV took place on May 15th, when the MAG was abolished and its staff integrated into that of the senior command. In June, MACV itself was restructured under a new table of distribution. These changes reflected the anticipated influx of advisors and support personnel and therefore concerned the Army more than the other U.S. armed services. Initially, the number of Marine billets on the restructured Military Assistance Command staff did not change substantially. 24 Marines, 15 officers, and 9 enlisted were included in the new table of distribution. This represented a net increase of only 1 over the number previously assigned to the MAG and MACV staffs. By the end of September, however, Marines temporarily assigned to the MACV staff from FMF PAC commands brought the onboard strength to 37. Another increase occurred in the early fall when 8 more permanent Marine billets, 3 officers and 5 enlisted, were approved. Changes in Marine leadership. 2 key links in the Marine command chain that joined government policy decisions in Washington to Marine Corps operations in Vietnam changed hands during the first 60 days of 1964. On January 1st, General Wallace M. Greene, Jr. replaced General Shoup as Commandant of the Marine Corps. Greene, known in American military circles as a brilliant staff officer, had been serving since 1960 as Chief of Staff of the Marine Corps. By 1964, he had become an outspoken supporter of South Vietnam's struggle for independence. As a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and as a Chief of Service, his presence in administration policies would be felt until his tour as Commandant ended on January 31, 1967. An equally important change was the appointment of General William Westmoreland as Commander of the U.S. Army in Vietnam, January 1967. An equally important change occurred in early March, when General Greene named Lieutenant General Victor H. Krulak to replace General Roberts as Commanding General FMF PAC. A 1934 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, Krulak had won the Navy Cross during ground action in World War II. He arrived in the Pacific from Washington, where he had served both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson as Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency Matters. Having made numerous fact-finding trips to Vietnam in this capacity, he was intimately familiar with the unique political-military struggle being waged there. He also had a reputation of being one of Washington's most vocal advocates of resisting communist aggression in Southeast Asia. A dynamic leader and a man of strong convictions, Krulak was to exert a pervasive influence over all Marine operations in the Pacific for nearly half a decade. Less obvious, but of immense importance to both the Marine Corps and to the future of U.S. military operations in Vietnam, was a change instituted within MACV by General Westmoreland during the early part of the year. The command's modified table of organization called for the establishment of a Deputy Command U.S. MACV billet to be filled by an Army general officer. The joint table of distribution for the reorganized command specified that an Army general would also fill the Chief of Staff billet, a position which had been held by General Weed since MACV's creation in early 1962. Thus, when Weed's assignment ended in May, Major General Richard G. Stilwell, U.S. Army, became Westmoreland's Chief of Staff, while Lieutenant General John L. Throckmorton, U.S. Army, became Deputy Commander, U.S. MACV. The Marine Corps, however, did not lose its entire senior presence on the MACV staff. Brigadier General Carl A. Youngdale, an officer whose 30-year career included distinguished combat tours in both World War II and Korea, arrived January 15th for assignment as Assistant Chief of Staff J2 Intelligence. His presence on the MACV staff would ensure a Marine voice in U.S. military planning at the Saigon level. Still, many Marines saw their relative strength on Westmoreland's staff seriously reduced, a change which seemed to mark somewhat of a turning point in the overall management of the military assistance effort. Redesignation and reorganization. The reorganization of the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam had little initial effect on the Marine Advisory Program. With the dissolution of the MAG, the old naval section, under which the Marine advisors had operated since 1955, was redesignated the Naval Advisory Group, MACV. Lieutenant Colonel Noren's Marine Advisory Division, whose authorized strength remained at 11 officers and 9 enlisted men through the first half of the year, was also renamed in mid-May. Known thereafter as the Marine Advisory Unit Vietnam, the organization continued to function in much the same manner as it had under the previous arrangements. For his service as MACV Chief of Staff, General Weed was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. The last 5 months of the year, however, saw some substantial changes in the composition of the Marine Advisory Unit as the advisor buildup recently approved by the Secretary of Defense began. Colonel William P. Nesbitt, a recent graduate of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, relieved Colonel Noren, promoted from Lieutenant Colonel on July 1st, as the Senior Marine Advisor on September 4th. Colonel Nesbitt arrived in time to supervise the implementation of a new table of organization which added 8 first lieutenants and a captain to the advisory unit in November. The captain and one of the lieutenants were assigned as advisor and assistant advisor, respectively, to a new Vietnamese Marine Infantry Battalion, which was in the process of being formed. 4 other first lieutenants joined Colonel Nesbitt's command as assistant advisors to existing infantry battalions, and 1 became the assistant artillery advisor. The 2 remaining lieutenants were assigned as advisors to the brigade's motor transport and communications companies, replacing non-commissioned advisors. 2 billets were downgraded in rank: the engineer advisor from captain to first lieutenant, and the artillery advisor from major to captain. In addition to phasing out 3 enlisted advisor billets, these changes relieved the Assistant Senior Marine Advisor of his artillery responsibilities. Colonel Earl E. Anderson, who had been serving since mid-1963 as the MAG Chief of Staff, was instrumental in bringing about this particular modification. Under the old arrangement, the Senior Marine Advisor's presence frequently had been required at the MAG headquarters in Saigon, while the Vietnamese Marine Brigade headquarters was deployed to combat. As the Assistant Senior Marine Advisor was likewise torn between 2 jobs, Anderson had directed that he be relieved of artillery advisory duties. Thus, Major Raymond C. Dam, an officer who had served as Assistant Naval Attaché in Saigon between 1959 and 1961, became the first full-time Assistant Senior Marine Advisor after he joined Colonel Nesbitt's command in May. When the changes were finally completed, the restructured and redesignated Marine Advisory Unit included permanent billets for 24 officers and men, 18 officers, and 6 enlisted men. Another important aspect of the overall Marine Advisory Program was altered in the closing months of 1964. Since Lieutenant Colonel Crozat's tour with the Vietnamese Marines in the immediate post-Geneva period, most Marine advisors had attended French language courses prior to departing for service in Vietnam. As French influence in Vietnam faded during the late 1950s, however, the requirement for the language had gradually diminished, particularly as French maps were replaced by American ones. By the early 1960s, this situation had prompted several Marine advisors to recommend that instruction in French be replaced by Vietnamese language training. Primarily through the persistence of Colonels Moody and Noren, the policy was revised in 1964. The arrival of the new advisors in the fall marked the first time that Marine officers had received formal Vietnamese language training before beginning their tours. Colonel Nesbitt, who had the advantage of commanding advisors trained in both languages, saw the change as a marked step forward in improving the advisory effort. The Vietnamese Marine Brigade. At the beginning of 1964, the 6,109-man Vietnamese Marine Brigade, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Ba Linh, experienced a crisis of morale. The recent command changes that had occurred at almost every echelon and a soaring desertion rate combined to undermine the brigade's combat readiness. In February, the Khan government recalled Colonel Le Nguyen Cong from the Philippines, promoted him to brigadier general, and reinstated him as commandant in an attempt to restore the unit's spirit. A veteran Marine who had been instrumental in the development of the VNMC since its inception, Cang commanded confidence throughout the Corps. Following his return, increased attention was given to the welfare of the individual Marine and his dependents in order to reduce the climbing desertion rate. Under the close supervision of the senior Vietnamese officers and their American advisors, the morale problem was gradually overcome. Throughout the year, the Vietnamese Marine Brigade continued to share the role of South Vietnam's General Reserve Force with an ARVN Airborne Brigade. Normally, at least one Marine battalion was held in the vicinity of Saigon, ready to respond to tactical emergencies while others operated nearby in support of the HOP-TAC campaign. Still, the brigade's infantry battalions managed to see action in every Corps tactical zone except I Corps, which was the farthest removed from the capital. Motivated at least partially by the requirement to provide better support for the pacification strategy, the Vietnamese government restructured its paramilitary forces in the spring of 1964. The old Self-Defense Corps was expanded dramatically and renamed the Popular Force, PF. The Civil Guard was reorganized and designated the Regional Force, RF. More importantly, the RVNAF extended its control over both paramilitary organizations for the first time since their creation. Although sometimes combined into regimental-sized task forces for specific operations, the individual Marine battalions normally were attached to either a corps, a province, or an ARVN division for combat operations. When so attached, the Vietnamese Marines often were assigned to clear particularly hazardous or difficult terrain. At times, they served as a reserve force, responding to crucial situations to either recoup or exploit actions initiated by other government units. In early January, the Vietnamese Joint General Staff assigned a Marine task force to a pacification mission in Viet Cong and Long An provinces, located just southeast of Saigon. Two VNMC battalions, controlled by a task force headquarters, moved into the operations area later in the month and remained until mid-September when the operation was terminated. The object of the Marine unit's presence was to reestablish government control over the region through systematic small unit operations designed to deny the enemy his usual freedom of movement. Despite the length of this particular deployment, the Vietnamese Marines fought no major engagements. Furthermore, they had not translated their improved morale into an effective pacification operation. While desertions and unauthorized absences remained low considering the duration of this particular assignment, Colonel Noren later recalled several flaws in the campaign. These operations, he remarked, were characterized by inadequate coordination of military operations and intelligence reporting, too little operational activity, and a seeming lack of appreciation of the objectives of pacification. Colonel Nesbitt, who became the senior Marine advisor as the operation entered its final stages, tended to confirm this assessment. The capacity of the task force headquarters in staff functioning, he reported, was marginal. While the drive to pacify the Viet Cong Long An areas was in progress, other Vietnamese Marine task forces were organized to undertake different combat assignments elsewhere in the southern portion of Vietnam. One, composed of 2 battalions, an artillery detachment, and a headquarters element, launched a brief clearing operation northwest of Saigon in heavily populated Tay Ninh province in January. A similar operation involving another task force was conducted the next month in the difficult mangrove swamps of An Xu Yen province at the southern tip of the nation. In both cases, the government offensives enjoyed local success but failed to reduce significantly the enemy's capabilities and influence in the area. Mid-year 1964 found the Vietnamese Marine commanders and their American advisors engaged in renewed efforts to restructure and expand the Vietnamese Marine Brigade. Accomplished for the most part in July, the salient feature of this latest reorganization was the creation of a new infantry battalion. With its nucleus garrisoned at a small base about 12 miles northwest of Saigon, the newly organized 5th Battalion devoted the remainder of the year and the first 6 months of 1965 to forming and training its companies. It finally became combat-ready in June 1965. Aside from the addition of the new infantry battalion, the mid-1964 reorganization produced other noteworthy changes in the structure of the Vietnamese Marine Corps. In the artillery battalion, the two 75mm pack howitzer batteries were combined into one battery of 8 weapons, while the one 105mm howitzer battery was divided to form 2 new batteries of 6 howitzers each. The tables of equipment were revised to reflect these adjustments. Another significant change occurred in the area of training. The training company was deleted from the amphibious support battalion, and a separate recruit training center was created at Tu Duc near Saigon. Tactical planning and control was also improved when the brigade headquarters was reduced in size and 2 smaller task force headquarters, Task Force A and Task Force B, were formed. Following the mid-1964 reorganization, the Vietnamese Marines performed combat missions not unlike those they had been assigned prior to July. One exception was that the brigade no longer found itself tasked with actual pacification phases of operations. Instead, the Marine battalions concentrated on clearing operations around Saigon in conjunction with the Hop-Tac campaign. Additionally, the various battalions were called upon occasionally during this period to provide security for key government installations located in Saigon and Vung Tau, assignments which gave the infantry units much-needed respites from field duty. By the end of the year, the Vietnamese Marine Corps had been improved in several areas. In the motor transport field, 2 new pieces of equipment were put into full-time operation: a high-pressure steam cleaner and an M108 wrecker. Progress also was made in upgrading the entire communications capability of the brigade when the table of equipment was revised in accordance with the modified table of organization. The new tables provided for modern test and repair equipment and eliminated obsolete and impractical items. Other unrealized improvements were still in their formative stages as the year closed. In the field of supply, for example, the brigade supply officer, with assistance from his American advisor, was drawing up plans which would give the Vietnamese Marines a more responsive and more manageable system. While the technically oriented programs were being developed and implemented, intensified training programs were preparing more and better trained Vietnamese Marines for their responsibilities. Established in July, the Marine Training Center at Tu Duc had graduated 1,464 recruits before the end of the year. These recruits, moreover, were trained by Vietnamese non-commissioned officers who had recently completed the drill instructor course at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego. For the first time since its inception, the VNMC was benefiting from a flow of recruits trained by Vietnamese Marines at a separate Marine training facility. Other programs likewise were helping prepare Vietnamese officers and non-commissioned officers to command and manage their growing service. A total of 718 officers and non-commissioned officers attended various training courses in South Vietnam during the year, while 42 more officers attended formal schools in the United States during the same period. Another 52 small unit leaders participated in on-the-job training programs with U.S. Marine units on Okinawa between January and December. Unfortunately, these developments were overshadowed by a military disaster which befell the 4th VNMC Battalion on the last day of the year. The Marine unit had been serving since early December as the reserve force for 3 Corps Tactical Zone. On the 27th, an estimated Viet Cong battalion overran the small pro-government town of Binh Gia, located in Phuoc Tuy Province, roughly 35 miles east of Saigon. 3 Corps officials reacted by dispatching the 4th Battalion and an ARVN Ranger Battalion to the area. The 4th Battalion, accompanied by 2 U.S. Marine advisors and 3 OJT observers from the 3rd Marine Division, was ordered to recapture the town. It proceeded to do so on the 30th, encountering no enemy opposition. Later in the day, while the Marines were developing defensive positions around the town, a spotter aircraft sighted a large Viet Cong force approximately 2 miles to the west and called for airstrikes. A U.S. Army helicopter gunship was shot down and its crew killed while attacking the target. Against the advice of his senior U.S. Marine advisor, Captain Franklin P. Eller, the 4th Battalion commander ordered one of his companies to secure the crash site and recover the bodies of the dead crewmen. Accompanied by Eller, First Lieutenant James P. Kelleher and Staff Sergeant Clifford J. Beaver, 2 of the 3rd Division OJTs, the company moved west from Binh Gia on the morning of the 31st to carry out the mission. After reaching the crash site, the Marine unit was ambushed by a large Viet Cong force using 82mm mortars, 57mm recoilless rifles, and 50 caliber machine guns. Unable to maneuver because of the intense fire, the company radioed for assistance and began withdrawing from the ambush site in small groups. The battalion commander, accompanied by the Assistant Marine Advisor, First Lieutenant Philip O. Brady, and the other OJTs, responded to the call for assistance by leading the remaining 3 companies from their positions at Binh Gia. Just outside the town, they met Captain Eller, who had been wounded in the face, along with Lieutenant Kelleher and the remnants of the hard-hit company. Eller and the survivors of the morning ambush returned to Binh Gia, while the remainder of the battalion pushed westward in an attempt to locate the enemy force. Later in the morning, the Marine column was surprised while moving through an abandoned rubber plantation by a communist force of between 1,200 and 1,800 men. No artillery was available to support the beleaguered battalion. Vietnamese Air Force A-1 Sky Raiders, however, were able to deliver close airstrikes for about 45 minutes. U.S. Army helicopter gunships replaced the Sky Raiders on station, but their rocket and machine gun fire proved too light to dislodge the enemy from his positions under the dense vegetation. By late afternoon, 29 of the 4th Battalion's 35 officers, including the battalion commander, were dead. In desperation, the Americans organized the surviving Vietnamese Marines into small groups, some of which managed to slip past the Viet Cong and find their way back to Binh Gia. The Vietnamese Marines had suffered their most decisive defeat of the war. Their losses were extremely high: 112 killed, 71 wounded, and 13 missing out of a 326-man battalion. Equipment losses included 142 weapons and over a dozen radios. Additionally, all 4 of the U.S. Marines who had participated in the disastrous action had been wounded. Both Captain Eller and Lieutenant Brady were later awarded the Silver Star Medal for their roles in the battle. Captain Donald G. Cook, one of the OJT observers from the 3rd Marine Division, was missing in action at the close of the battle. It was later learned that Captain Cook had been wounded and captured by the Viet Cong. Cook reportedly died in captivity in 1967. The Ranger Battalion operating nearby suffered a similar fate, incurring nearly 400 casualties in another violent ambush. Thus, within a 24-hour period, 2 elite government battalions had been shattered. Only later was it learned that the Marines and Rangers had clashed with 2 main force regiments of the 9th Viet Cong Division, the first communist division to become operational in South Vietnam. Personal decorations for heroism were awarded more frequently to Marine advisors through 1964. Earlier in the year, February 16th, a Marine captain, Donald E. Culper, an advisor to the 4th Vietnamese Marine Battalion, earned a Navy Cross, the nation's second highest award for heroism. Culper was decorated for warning the occupants of a crowded American theater in Saigon to take cover just prior to the detonation of a Viet Cong terrorist bomb. The Marine was killed by a Viet Cong satchel charge, but his sacrifice limited the number of casualties to 3 killed and 51 wounded. As a result of the disastrous engagement at Binh Gia, the 4th Vietnamese Marine Battalion was rendered ineffective as a fighting force for a period of 3 months. This loss created 2 immediate problems for General Kang and his American advisors. It reduced the brigade's available infantry strength by approximately 25% and placed an added burden on the Recruit Training Center, which was already laboring to provide enough new troops to fill the 5th Battalion. For the Vietnamese Marine Corps, 1964 ended on a discouraging note. Additional Marine activities. U.S. Marine participation in the Vietnam War during 1964 was not limited to the activities of the Advisory Division and the Helicopter Task Element. Various other Marine units and detachments made significant, although less publicized, contributions to the war effort throughout the year. One of these was the Marine Security Detachment, which continued to protect the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Twice during the year, the growing political unrest and the increasing threat of communist terrorist attacks prompted the expansion of the Security Detachment, first in April and again in October. By the end of the year, the detachment's strength stood at 30 Marines, a figure which made it the second largest such unit in the world. Only the Marine Detachment in Paris, with 37 officers and men, was larger. And nowhere was an embassy guard assignment more dangerous than in Vietnam, where terrorist attacks were apt to occur at any time. Other groups of Marines performed an assortment of missions in support of the government of Vietnam during the course of the year. The detachment, 1st Composite Radio Company, for example, continued its duties at the U.S. Army Communications installation in Pleiku. A handful of these Marines also served at a newly opened U.S. Army Communications station at Phu Bai, some 8 miles southeast of Hue. The strength of the detachment, 1st Composite Radio Company, however, was reduced from 42 officers and men to only 16 by the end of December. The spring of 1964 saw a new, substantially larger Marine Communications Detachment introduced into the northern provinces of South Vietnam. Unlike its predecessors at Pleiku and Phu Bai, this unit was composed exclusively of Marines and included an infantry element for security purposes. Designated the Signal Engineering Survey Unit, the radio detachment consisted of 3 officers and 27 enlisted men drawn from the 1st Radio Company, FMF PAC, and from Headquarters Marine Corps. This element, commanded by Major Alfred M. Gray, Jr., arrived at Da Nang on May 20th, along with a 76-man infantry detachment from Company G, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines. The infantry element, reinforced with an 81mm mortar section, 2 mortars, was commanded by 1st Lieutenant Raymond J. Otlowski. Major Gray assumed overall command of the composite force, which was designated Marine Detachment Advisory Team 1. Advisory Team 1 became the first actual Marine ground unit to conduct independent operations in the Republic of Vietnam. U.S. Air Force C-123 Provider transports airlifted the bulk of the newly formed unit to the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, CIDG, camp at Khe Sanh in northwestern Quang Tri Province in the closing days of May. 2 officers and 5 enlisted communicators remained behind at Da Nang, and a 4-man team positioned itself in the U.S. Army compound at Phu Bai to provide radio support for the main body. At Khe Sanh, Advisory Team 1 initially concentrated on building a solid supply base prior to undertaking actual communications operations. ARVN truck convoys brought the preponderance of its supplies from Quang Tri over Route 9, the old colonial road that snaked through the Annamite Mountains into Laos. While Major Gray and his men proceeded with this task, Marine UH-34 Delta Seahorses from Da Nang hell-lifted an ARVN infantry company onto Tiger Tooth Mountain, Dong Voi Mep, a jungle-covered mountain located 8 miles north of the CIDG camp. With an elevation of 5,500 feet, Tiger Tooth Mountain is the highest terrain feature in northern I Corps. On June 13th, U.S. Army UH-1 Bravo Iroquois helicopters lifted Major Gray, 9 enlisted men, and several thousand pounds of equipment into a tiny landing zone which the South Vietnamese troops had hacked out near the top of the rugged mountain. The ARVN soldiers, who had established a rough perimeter around a peak slightly below the mountain's highest point, were on hand to greet the small group of Americans. After the initial hell lift, however, bad weather in the form of dense clouds intervened to delay the remainder of the movement for an entire week. Shoofly helicopters finally completed the mission on June 21st. When the hell lift concluded, 73 Marines and roughly 100 Vietnamese troops were strung around and across a 5,000-foot peak just south of Tiger Tooth's highest elevation. Another 81 leathernecks remained at Khe Sanh to provide a pool from which fresh security forces and radio men could be drawn when needed. MACV orders explicitly prohibited the Marines on Tiger Tooth Mountain from patrolling or engaging in any other activity which could have been construed as offensive in nature. As a result of this restriction, Major Gray's men were confined to defensive positions around the crude little landing zone and the tents which housed the radio equipment. Even so, life on the mountain was extremely rigorous. The clouds which frequently enshrouded the mountaintop left the Marines, their clothing, weapons, and equipment constantly damp. High winds heightened their discomfort. The local weather conditions also made food and water deliveries to the position hazardous and irregular. Marine seahorses prepositioned at Khe Sanh brought sea rations and water cans whenever the clouds revealed Tiger Tooth's higher elevations. Often, however, the weather did not break for days. Normally, the men were limited to 2 canteens of water daily, a restriction which made bathing and shaving impossible. Because of the harsh living conditions on the mountain, fresh security forces and radio men were rotated from Khe Sanh at 2-week intervals, weather permitting. Advisory Team 1 operated in the extreme northwestern corner of the Republic without incident until the 2nd week of July. Then a severe storm struck its mountaintop base, blowing away tents and antenna, collapsing fighting positions, and generally disrupting operations. Several nights later, on the 17th, a Viet Cong force of undetermined size probed the marine sector of the perimeter. An intense exchange of small arms and automatic weapons fire ensued for nearly 2 hours. Although the Marines suffered no casualties and could find no dead or wounded Viet Cong the next day, it was apparent that their location had been compromised. Amid reports of increasing communist activity throughout the area, MACV authorities in Saigon promptly ordered Major Gray to withdraw his force from Tiger Tooth Mountain. Fortunately, good weather permitted Marine helicopters from Da Nang to heli-lift the men and their equipment from the mountain to Khe Sanh the day after the firefight. On the 22nd, Air Force provider transports airlifted the entire Marine detachment to Da Nang. There, Gray and his Marines crowded into the old French compound occupied by the helicopter task element. Although cramped, the Shoo-Fly facilities provided welcome relief for the men who had endured the rigors of Tiger Tooth Mountain and Khe Sanh for nearly 2 months. While at Da Nang, Major Gray detached a small group of radio men to Monkey Mountain, a rocky, jungle-covered peninsula that jutted into the South China Sea just northeast of the city. There, in relative comfort and safety, the technicians conducted equipment tests for 2 weeks. Several changes in the leadership and composition of the advisory team took place during this interval. Captain Raymond A. Becker, a communications officer from the 1st Radio Company, FMF PAC, relieved Major Gray as the commander of the unit on August 13th. Soon thereafter, a reinforced infantry company, Company K, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, commanded by Captain William R. Irwin, replaced Lieutenant Otlowski and the Company G Marines as the advisory team's security element. Under Captain Becker's command, Advisory Team 1 redeployed, this time to Dong Bok Ma, a 3,500-foot mountain located roughly 25 miles west-northwest of Da Nang. An abandoned French resort, still untouched by the war, sprawled across the higher elevations of Bok Ma, and a hard surface road curved up its steep northern face from Route 1. Using this road, ARVN trucks moved Captain Irwin and the infantry element to the newly selected site in advance of the radio personnel. Once atop the mountain, Irwin had his men establish a perimeter around an abandoned monastery. This accomplished, Marines cleared a small helicopter landing zone near the old but well-preserved religious building, which was to serve as their base of operations. On August 19th, Marine helicopters lifted Captain Becker, his communicators, and some 4,000 pounds of equipment to the site from Da Nang. Advisory Team 1, relying heavily on Marine helicopters for logistical support, operated without incident from the quaint old monastery until the second week of September. The composite unit completed its operations at Bok Ma on the 10th, whereupon it returned to Da Nang. Within days, the detachment was disbanded without fanfare. The radio experts returned to their parent commands in Hawaii and Washington, while Company K was airlifted to Okinawa, where it rejoined the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. The quiet dissolution of the Marine Detachment Advisory Team 1 ended the first brief and little publicized chapter of Marine Ground Unit operations in the Republic of Vietnam. South Vietnam's core boundaries were adjusted again in late 1964. The southern boundary of I Corps was moved south to include Quang Ngai Province. The southern border of II Corps was also moved southward to include 8 provinces formerly encompassed by III Corps. Under the new arrangement, 3CTZ formed a narrow strip across the nation which centered roughly on Saigon. The capital military district, the boundaries of which coincided with those of Gia Dinh Province, formed an enclave within III Corps. The southernmost tactical zone, IV Corps, encompassed the entire Mekong Delta. In October, an element of the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, 3rd Marine Division, operating from ships of the 7th Fleet, conducted an extensive survey of Cam Ranh Bay in southern II Corps. The purpose of its survey was to determine the feasibility of establishing a naval facility. Marine counterintelligence teams from FMF PAC also were temporarily assigned to MAC-V for 30-day periods throughout the year. These officers and non-commissioned officers normally augmented the U.S. Army 704th Counterintelligence Unit during their stay in Vietnam. Another group of Marines to employ their skills in the counterinsurgency environment was a small special operations group of 6 officers and 21 enlisted men. These Marines conducted operations under the auspices of MAC-V. A more permanent influx of Marines into the war-torn Republic occurred in the last quarter of the year. In response to the intensified advisory effort ordered by Secretary McNamara in July, General Greene, the new Marine Commandant, assured the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the Marines could be expected to carry their share of the increased burden. Shortly thereafter, the Marine Corps was directed to provide 60 officers and non-commissioned officers to serve as advisors with ARVN units in E-Corps Tactical Zone. These orders, later described by Major Dam, the Assistant Senior Marine Advisor to the VNMC, as very short-fused ones, were executed without delay. The 3rd Marine Division was given short notice to select suitable personnel and to transfer them immediately to Commander U.S. MacV. In response to these instructions, the Okinawa-based command quickly formed 4 advisory teams, each composed of 4 men: a captain, a first lieutenant, a gunnery sergeant, and a corporal, who was to serve as the team's radio operator. Accompanied by Major John W. Walker, the first increment of Marine advisors was airlifted to Da Nang by KC-130 Hercules in mid-September. Upon reporting to the E-Corps Senior U.S. Advisor, Colonel Howard B. St. Clair, U.S. Army, the 4 teams were broken up, the Marines being assigned individually to battalions of the 1st and 2nd ARVN divisions. A number of the Marines scheduled to fill the newly created billets did not arrive until early 1965. Major Walker joined the I-Corps advisory staff in Da Nang as Assistant Operations Officer. The balance of the 60 new Marine advisors were formed into teams on Okinawa and airlifted to Da Nang in the ensuing weeks. By December, the advisors, who had initially been drawn from the 3rd Marine Division, were being replaced gradually by officers and non-commissioned officers just beginning their normal 12-month overseas tours. 2 additional permanent Marine advisor billets were also approved in the closing weeks of 1964. These were created within the Naval Advisory Group to assist the Vietnamese Navy in controlling one of South Vietnam's most troublesome areas, the Rung Sat Special Zone, RSSZ. Located southeast of Saigon on both sides of the Long Tao River, the main ship channel to the capital, the Rung Sat was a vast, difficult-to-penetrate mangrove swamp. Due largely to its relative inaccessibility, the area had been developed by the Viet Cong into a key base for supporting their operations in the surrounding provinces. More significantly, by early 1964, the communist-held Rung Sat posed a serious threat to commercial ships bound for Saigon. For this reason, the responsibility for pacifying the area was turned over to the Vietnamese Navy in April. Initially, 1 Marine Major, Edward J. Broners, was assigned to assist and advise the Vietnamese Navy in its attempts to secure the Rung Sat. In November, however, the RSSZ advisory staff was reorganized to include 1 Marine captain and 1 sergeant. Although they did not arrive for duty until early the following year, the newly approved billets created the 3rd distinct group of Marine ground advisors assigned to the Republic of Vietnam. The OJT program continued in effect for junior Marine officers and staff non-commissioned officers throughout 1964. Near the end of the year, the program was broadened somewhat to include members of Hawaii-based Marine commands. Each month, 10 Leathernecks arrived at Da Nang to begin their 30-day assignments. At Shufly headquarters, the visitors were briefed as a group before being attached individually to specific South Vietnamese units for the duration of their stay in Vietnam. Normally, the officers and staff non-commissioned officers joined a unit already being advised by a U.S. Marine. When possible, the OJT was assigned to a unit which could benefit from his particular military and technical skills. Still, the on-the-job trainee was not always considered an asset. In honesty, one permanent advisor to the Vietnamese Marine Corps conceded, OJTs were a mixed blessing. They provided some help, but they also were an added responsibility for the VNMC commander who was charged with their safety. Some OJTs, he added, received misperceptions of the capability of the Viet Cong, since their knowledge/experience was limited to the events occurring during their brief 30-day tour. Nevertheless, a significant number of Marine small unit leaders were able to gain some degree of first-hand experience in counter-guerrilla warfare under the provisions on the OJT program. The 3rd Marine Division's OJT program did not end until after elements of the division landed at Da Nang in March 1965. The Marine Advisory Unit experimented successfully with another form of augmentation in the first days of 1965. When the Vietnamese Marines deployed to the Binh Gia area with a provisional brigade in early January, Colonel Nesbitt, who was still serving as senior Marine advisor, requested additional personnel to assist and advise at the staff level. FMF PAC responded by temporarily detaching 8 officers and 11 enlisted men to the advisory division. MACV provided 2 more Marine officers and 7 additional enlisted men, all of whom remained attached to the Marine Advisory Unit for the duration of the operation. The temporarily assigned Marines returned to their parent organizations when the operation terminated. This is covered in more detail in the 1965 account of U.S. Marine activities in Vietnam. A similar but shorter-term program for field-grade officers and colonels, the Job-Related Orientation (JRO) program, also took hold during the early months of 1964. Instituted in the last half of the previous year, the JRO program provided for a small number of staff officers from the various FMF PAC commands to visit U.S. headquarters in Vietnam and Thailand for an 8-day period. Small groups of these officers arrived at Da Nang from Okinawa and, like the OJTs, were briefed by the Helicopter Task Element Commander and his staff. Later, they were afforded an orientation flight over the northern provinces. Next, the visiting officers were flown to Saigon, where they received more briefings at MACV headquarters. In the capital, where they were hosted by the senior Marine advisor, they visited Vietnamese Marine units and discussed tactics and problem areas with the advisors. After 4 days in the Republic of Vietnam, the Marines traveled on to Bangkok, where they spent the balance of their visit. Upon the conclusion of these JRO trips, each officer was required to submit a detailed written report to the commanding general, FMF PAC. In turn, extracts of these reports were forwarded to the Commandant of the Marine Corps in Washington. Generally, these reports addressed tactical, operational, logistics, and intelligence matters. But a number of the Marine officers used the reporting system to articulate their opinions relative to the overall direction of the war. Colonel Warren P. Baker, a member of the 3rd Marine Division staff who visited Vietnam in March, pointed out that field advisors and MACV staff members differed sharply in their personal assessments of progress being made. The field advisors, Baker observed, demonstrated far less optimism than did the staff members. Furthermore, he reported that unless the people of South Vietnam could be won over to the government, the Viet Cong's success could be expected to continue. Another officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry E. Dickinson, summarized his conclusions with an even more emphatic warning. The commitment of sizable U.S. combat units should not be affected except to protect the seat of government. While local success might be achieved in certain areas, it is extremely doubtful whether any lasting degree of success would entail in the northern and western sections. As combat units were increased, the forces of Vietnam would do less and less with the inevitable conflict of overall command. The end result should be the wringing of the country with combat units, but no solution for the internal conflict. I strongly disagree that any 2 or 3 divisions could achieve real victory, as has been stated in the press. Through candid reporting of this nature, Marine commanders from Okinawa to Washington were kept abreast of the complex and difficult problems being generated by the war in Southeast Asia. Postscript. to the episode Colonel Donald Gilbert Cook, USMC Medal of Honor, posthumous, Vietnam War. Overview: The Battle of Binh Gia and Captain Cook's capture. The Battle of Binh Gia was fought from December 28, 1964 to January 1, 1965, in Phuoc Tuy Province, roughly 40 miles southeast of Saigon. Two Viet Cong regiments, the 271st and 272nd, soon consolidated as the VC 9th Division, supported by Pavan Cadre, seized the predominantly Catholic refugee village of Binh Gia and then stood and fought. The first time main force VC units held ground in a large set-piece engagement against the ARVN. Two airlifted ARVN Ranger companies were ambushed and badly mauled on December 29th. The elite 4th Battalion Vietnamese Marine Corps Killer Sharks was committed on December 30th and pushed the VC east of the village. Final ARVN losses ran to roughly 200 killed, nearly 200 wounded, and 5 U.S. advisors killed. Ho Chi Minh reportedly called the outcome a little Dien Bien Phu, and the battle is widely cited as one of the events that convinced President Johnson the ARVN could not hold the South without U.S. ground troops. Captain Donald G. Cook, USMC, was serving as an observer/advisor with the 4th Vietnamese Marine Battalion when, on December 31, 1964, the unit was sent to recover the crew of a U.S. helicopter shot down at a nearby rubber plantation. The Marines walked into a prepared VC ambush. Cook was wounded in the lower extremities and carried off by Viet Cong troops, becoming the first U.S. Marine taken prisoner in the Vietnam War. He was held in a series of primitive jungle POW camps north of Saigon and reportedly died of malaria on December 8, 1967. His remains have never been recovered. He was posthumously promoted to colonel and is the only Marine ever to receive the Medal of Honor for actions performed while in captivity. USS Donald Cook, DDG-75, is named in his honor. Medal of Honor Citation: For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, while interned as a prisoner of war by the Viet Cong in the Republic of Vietnam during the period from 31 December 1964 to 8 December 1967. Despite the fact that by so doing he would bring about harsher treatment for himself, Colonel, then Captain, Cook established himself as the senior prisoner even though in actuality he was not. Repeatedly assuming more than his share of the manual labor in order that the other prisoners of war could improve the state of their health, Colonel Cook willingly and unselfishly put the interests of his comrades before that of his own well-being and eventually his life. Giving more needy men his medicine and drug allowance while constantly nursing them, he risked infection from contagious diseases while in a rapidly deteriorating state of health. This unselfish and exemplary conduct, coupled with his refusal to stray even the slightest from the code of conduct, earned him the deepest respect from not only his fellow prisoners, but his captors as well. Rather than negotiate for his own release or better treatment, he steadfastly frustrated attempts by the Viet Cong to break his indomitable spirit, and passed this same resolve on to the men with whose well-being he so closely associated himself. Knowing his refusals would prevent his release prior to the end of the war, and also knowing his chances for prolonged survival would be small in the event of continued refusal, he chose, nevertheless, to adhere to a code of conduct far above that which could be expected. His personal valor and exceptional spirit of loyalty in the face of almost certain death reflected the highest credit upon Colonel Cook, the Marine Corps, and the United States Naval Service.